Hi everyone, Magnus here, and this video that I'm about to do today came at the request of someone in the comments of a video that I made previously when we were looking at the Sicilian defense, which is this one, and they obviously saw that it was a good weapon against e4, but were wondering what you're meant to do against pawn to d4 because obviously you can't just play the Sicilian against everything, even though it is such a nice weapon. So, in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my recommendation against pawn to d4. I think this works great at all levels, but we're going to start with the basic themes and ideas and the most common setups that you're probably going to get with the black pieces against pawn to d4 when playing the King's Indian, which starts with the move knight to f6. This is an invitation to the Queen's Gambit, which is pawn to c4. This is going to be probably a 5 or 6 part series. We are going to be covering probably some of the other moves as well, like knight to c3 and bishop f4, like going for the Jabava London. I'm also going to show you what I think is a good system against the London, as well as some other slightly less confrontational systems like maybe the Collie or even the Dutch setup, the reverse Dutch for white. But in this starting video, we're going to be focusing on the move pawn to d4 and c4, which allows us to play King's Indian defense with g6 and bishop g7. So standard here for white is developing this knight. Idea is they want to put a pawn in the center, and you can stop this by playing this Grunfeld setup, but the King's Indian defense is all about hypermodern play, and you want to allow white to get this full center, as you can see these nice 3 pawns here, but you're going to fight back against the center later on in the game with like your D pawn, maybe the C pawn, and the E pawn, like this. Okay, and in the meantime, you're going to try and get some extra development and maybe start a kingside attack. But in the system that I'm going to show you, it's actually not the standard system. What I'm about to show you is what I think is a nice sideline. You're going to be getting out of your opponent's comfort zone and into your comfort zone, hopefully, after you get some experience in this setup. Okay, so e4 is the most common move. Like I said, I'll be covering g3, knight to f3, and also e4, f3, same-ish setups in later videos, but I simply wouldn't have time to do it all in just one. Okay, so e4, we're going to castle here, and the reason I like to castle is because it invites this setup, which I don't think is very good from white, which is pawn to e5, and there's actually a famous Bobby Fischer game after pawn to f4 when you put all these pawns in the center, and I believe that you can go for d6 and then c5. So something like d6, knight to f3, pawn to c5, and if they take on c5, you can play knight to c6, which is a cool gambit. And basically, the idea is that you're going to go down a pawn for a bit of the game, but you get lots of development, and you're going to you're going to win back this pawn basically. So after something like castles, you can just take this pawn and you'll have a good game, a couple exchanges, and your opponent will be left with a weak center pawn that you can try and capture. You'll have this very nice bishop down the diagonal, and you can play like this. So I don't think that e5 is a very good move from white, and for that reason, most people play knight to f3 or bishop to e2. You don't have to learn different stuff for bishop e2 and knight f3 because pretty much every single time after you play d6, it will transpose, vice versa. If they go bishop e2, they'll play knight f3. If they play knight f3, they'll probably go bishop e2. So you don't have to worry about that. Now, here is where things get different from the normal King's Indian. In the normal King's Indian, you go pawn to e5, or knight to c6, pawn e5, or something like this, and you'll get d5, and then maybe you'll play like knight d7, put your knight back, play f5, and try and have a good game. But in the setup that I'm going to show you, the move is knight to a6, and the point of this move is actually that you're trying to slow down the queenside expansion, so you're trying to win on both sides of the board. When normally in the King's Indian, you kind of just throw everything all in on this kingside attack, Knight a6 is slightly more reserved, and you can often get some nice positional games, as well as having a bit of a kingside attack, although often the attack isn't quite as ferocious. There's also a lot less risk in terms of getting crushed on the queen side. So castles is very common here. Pawn to e5, and the two main moves that we're going to look at are rook e1 and bishop to e3. d5 is just bad because you're going to go knight c5, and after something like queen c2 to guard the pawn, you go a5 and you solidify your knight on this c5 square forever. And you're going to play a move like knight h5, knight to f4, pressuring these pieces here. Those are some of the worst arrows I've ever drawn. And then you're going to go f5 and try and break open the position. Probably play h6 first. Often when you're going f5 in these setups, you want to have h6 in so that the knight doesn't jump. But at the same time, with a knight on c5 and a bishop, this actually is not a problem. But these positions are very good for black, and generally white, if they know what they're doing, will not play pawn to d5. Okay, but what I am going to be covering is I'm going to cover the move rook e1 first, because this is a slightly shorter line. What I actually recommend against this move is not the main line with bishop g4. I think that you can get very good positions from just taking this pawn in the center, and after they take back with the knight, you can attack their pawn in the middle. They'll either play f3 or bishop to f1. Let's say they play bishop f1. You can go knight c5, adding more pressure to this pawn, and after something like f3, you can start pushing your a pawn. And basically, the point of a5 is that you're going to prevent this move pawn to b4, and then in this specific setup, you're going to play like c6, and you're going to try and push this pawn all the way, and there's going to be some trick where you go queen b6. So I'm just going to give you an example here. You keep pushing, say. If they ever play a3, then you have this fixed pawn structure, which is very nice. And you can play a move like c6, queen c7, and you're eventually going to trade off one of these knights. And you're just going to have a fairly decent position. Actually, you might not want to move this guy because he's guarding the pawn, but you can play for queen c7. And you can often move this knight back as well, trying to attack. There's opportunities for f5 sometimes. Basically, what actually ends up happening here is that black kind of just waits around to see what white does. And eventually, if white makes an overcommitment with like f4 or something, which your opponents will do because they will get bored and they'll try and start pushing. But as soon as they say, let's say, play something like f4, as you can see, this pawn will fall. So they'll only play f4 when your knight moves away, but then you can move right back and capture the pawn. Okay, so that's pretty much that setup. So I don't think rook e1 is really that bad. Doesn't seem too testing for white. I think the most testing response is actually bishop to e3, and the reason for that is because it encourages this move knight g4. If you don't play knight g4, you're often going to get not a very nice position because they get the bishop on e3 immediately and can start playing for moves like c5. So let's say you were to play this, they can play c5, and this always looks quite scary because I feel like the entire position could start collapsing. So generally, I would avoid this, but there is this pretty forcing line with knight to g4, which can get very spicy if white doesn't know what they're doing. Pretty much the only move here is bishop g5. If they go bishop c1, you're just going to capture, put your knight in the middle. It's not a big deal. But bishop g5 hits the queen, so you have to respond. I like queen to e8. I used to play f6, but I didn't really like the positions that much because I always felt like, I can't really play for f5. It's just a bit weird putting the pawn on f6, and often the queen's better on e8 because you're out of the line of their queen, so that when they're capturing, you don't have to worry about queen trades. Okay, so I like queen to e8, and capturing is extremely common. Another common move is actually h3, but in this situation, you can throw in this in-between move f6, counter-attacking their bishop, and if they take your knight, you can take their bishop, and this pawn is going to be loose, and after they were to say take back, you would just take in the center, and everything is collapsing. You can attack their knight. This pawn is falling, and the position is just no good. Let's say that the knight would have moved back. Knight c5 already comes in. f3 trying to hold everything together. Boom, d3. And now you're attacking this bishop, and you're also attacking the b2 pawn. Black would win the game. So there's a lot of ways that this can go terribly wrong for white. For that reason, after the move f6, if white knows what they're doing, they'll go bishop to d2, and after knight to h6, getting out of trouble. Often you'll see this knight h6, knight f7 maneuver if you start learning the Gleck defense in the King's Indian. So this stuff with knight a6, you've got both the knights on the rim, kind of just hanging out, but it's actually quite good. So you'll pretty much just play knight to f7. You're going to play c6, bring the other knight to e6. Eventually you're going to break with f5, and you're going to try and get a decent game, both the knights jumping around. You might even play a5, a4, but often you'll play on the king side. Pretty flexible game, and I think black does quite well. You will kind of just have to play it for yourself to get some more experience for the positions, but these are the general plans. If you can just push on the king side, try and chip away at this h3 pawn. There's a couple interesting ideas, like you can play bishop f8, rook f7, rook g7, get your rook on the g file and start attacking. This bishop's always really useful when pressuring these pawns as well. Okay. The other main move here is taking this pawn in the center, and after you take back, a lot of people like to play h3, and then after f6, bishop d2, knight h6, and c5. But I think it's quite important. This probably won't get played that much because c5 is a pretty crazy move to find if you don't already know it. The point is that it's a pawn sacrifice, but you can capture this. Well, you capture this pawn. Sorry, not that. You play you play knight d5. You have to go knight e6 to defend this pawn, and then after the move queen to c1, which is really cool. Queen c1 hits the knight, and after knight f7, you go. I think it's bishop to b4. And so bishop to b4 basically traps the rook. And you might think that this looks quite bad, but you actually have to move c6, bishop takes, and after queen takes, knight to e3, you go knight d6, and you actually get a good position. Even though you're actually down the exchange, you have a pawn for it already, and you've got this nice pawn majority. You've already got pressure on this e-pawn. You have the bishop pair, which can often come to life, and you also have this f5, f4 pawn break. I'll just show. I think I've actually had a game that went like queen c2. I played f5, and I got a good position. I think I put a knight in the center, captured this pawn, and got a protected pawn. Played like bishop e6, queen f7, brought in the rook, and I had a nice game and win the win. Okay, so I think that's about most of that line. I'm just gonna take a look. Yeah. There's some alternatives. You can also play h6 if you want. If you're not interested in that craziness, you can just play h6 and then go for c6, knight c7, knight e6. Stuff with knight h7 as well, f5. And you can get a fairly safe game like that if you don't want to get involved with all the craziness. But I think other than that, we have covered bishop to e3. We've not covered bishop to g5, mostly because I just don't think it's very good. You can just play h6. If they go bishop h4, you go g5, and after they go back, there's knight h5. And black's already better here. You're going to capture this bishop here. If they try and do like some interesting discoveries, it's no good. You just capture, you're hitting the rook, and you're going to take back the knight. So for that reason, they're going to lose their bishop. And so let's say they play something like this. You can even play knight to f4 because this knight will be a beast and they'll have to give it up. Or you can just take the bishop. And this isn't that bad. You'll play f5 and probably go f4 and black will also have a good game. So that's really the only other alternative move. I don't see a whole lot else. And yeah, so that's probably my introduction to the King's Indian. It's not really the easiest defense to pick up. I mean, you can play it as a beginner. The only thing is that your opponent is not going to be playing the main stuff, and they're probably not going to be playing very good moves. Like for example, I think as a beginner, you're much more likely to be facing pawn to e5, knight to e8, and something like even knight f3, because it just seems very natural. Like I'm going to push my pawns, get my knight out. They don't necessarily know all this theory, but so if you could learn one thing, I would probably go for something like this, where you look at d6, and you can go for this capture here. And I reckon if you learn this position, you basically just win the pawn. So you would probably get something like this. And then you're going to capture the knight. You're going to win the e5 pawn, go up a pawn, and should win the game. So if you were to take probably one thing, if you are a slightly more beginner player in terms of rating, you're probably going to be facing e5 a significant amount of the time. So on e5, I would just make sure that you know that you're going to go knight e8, you're going to go d6, often you're going to go c5, unless they go knight f3. If they go knight f3 and bishop to e2, you can just capture that guy, and then you will win your pawn. If they take with the knight, you have got c5 undermining the knight as well. So a lot of really interesting ideas in terms of undermining the center when they overextend it. Okay, I know that was probably quite a bit, and definitely a lot of information in not that long a video, but I can probably play some games in the next video, trying to show you in a more live example the kinds of positions you might get, because there's only so much opening preparation you can do. But if you want to just remember the basics, generally when you get these standard setups, you're going for d6, knight a6, e5, knight c5. If you can remember this setup, and you know the fact that you can play pawn a5 to guard your knight, and when a bishop comes out to e3, you go knight g4, and you know that when your queen is counterattacked, you can go to e8. If you know all this stuff, you're probably going to get along just fine and not do too bad. You just know the basic ideas. You know that like c6 is generally a good move once you've had these exchange of pawns in the center, because it restricts their knight from moving forward. And really, the best way to learn this opening is just to pick a setup. So like if for me, I was picked the knight a6 setup, and I just played games, and every time I forgot what I was doing, I reviewed the game and checked what the theory was and what I was meant to be playing, and just reminded myself so that when I go into the next game, if I got the same position and I remembered it that time, then I could play what I remembered, and that really does cement the knowledge when it does come to memorization. Okay, so I think that's about all for my first part of the King's Indian series. If you did find it helpful, please do consider liking and subscribing, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!